I'm proud to stand with my colleagues and support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Chris Penk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on the Residential Tenancies Prohibiting Letting Fees Amendment Bill. Sir, in the explanatory note on the bill, it is stated that by paying, and I quote, by paying a letting fee, tenants are bearing the cost associated with letting a rental property, where the benefit ultimately rests with the landlord, end quote. I think it's worth pointing out, Mr. Speaker, that, of course, the benefit of the arrangement, that is a tenancy, should rest with both parties if indeed the contract has been freely entered into. So I think it's perhaps somewhat limited in scope if we're talking only about the benefit being to one side or t'other in relation to the letting fee. Mr. Speaker, it's my belief that this Parliament should not lightly interfere with principles such as freedom of contract and sanctity of contract, such that two parties that are equal are able to enter into arrangements freely. Now, this principle is not absolute because it is possible, of course, for one-sided arrangements to be entered into, and so we must be on the guard for such situations as that, Mr. Speaker. But it's worth noting, I think, that the situation of residential tenancies, in accordance with the Act as it already exists, is not equal in any case. By way of example, in terms of giving notice, a tenant is required only to give, in the case of a periodic tenancy, 21 days notice, and the landlord, except in very particular circumstances specified in the Act, 90 days. And of course the difference between 90 days and 21 days is considerably more than the equivalent period that would be charged by way of letting fee. So it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that in discussing particular mechanisms that might be said to benefit one side or the other, that in fact, if we're to do so in a full, holistic and honest, intellectually honest fashion, then we do need to acknowledge that the Residential Tenancies Act in its current form, prior to such amendment as this bill would have us make, Mr. Speaker, is inherently unequal, at least in some parts in any case. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me there's some confusion around the difference between making law and enforcing law. Some of the examples that have been given from the other side of the House have spoken to examples which, if true, would be distressing, but that is not to say that they are necessarily examples of a shortfall in existing legislation, so much as perhaps oppressive practices by those who are not following the current law. So to me, Mr. Speaker, that would be an argument for enforcement of current rights as a preferable and certainly prior solution, as distinct from making further laws that will then not be enforced. So families moving 5 or 6 times a year, as has been mentioned, well, if there are fixed-term tenancies of 12 months as an initial period, that wouldn't be the case, or a notice of 90 days not being given and so forth. So, Mr. Speaker, that's probably enough for me on initial contribution to the bill, and we look forward to watching the passage of the legislation at least as far as it will go.
This is a split call, 5 minutes. I call Greg O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.